been reading all the stalker stories here on Let's Not Meet, and I suddenly remembered this strange and creepy occurrence from back when I was in high school, roughly 5 years ago, living in a small town with just Mom and some kitty cats. We lived in a really small town where everyone knows everyone. Population less than 3,000. It was a farming community, very conservative and dull. We never had any issues of any real kind, and our town has not had a murder in over 60 years. Even then, the last one was a jealous ex-lover, so there was no reason for us to really worry about crime. We left doors unlocked, windows open most of the time. At night, my mom religiously locked the doors, shut the windows, most of the time. All in all, we lived in a safe community, but it was a pretty rural area, so the houses were rather far apart, and there were almost no city lights to keep things illuminated in the middle of the night. About 2 weeks before the major incident of this story, my mom was walking home from work at the middle school, about 1.5 miles away, when she noticed an unmarked white van with tinted windows parked on the street ahead of her. She thought it was odd for a work-type van to have tinted windows, so she noticed that it was a bit suspicious, but continued her walk home. She passed the van and heard it start up when she walked by. As she turned the corner, the van pulled away from the curb and slowly followed. This obviously freaked her out, so she called me. High school gets out an hour before the middle school, so I was already home. She told me she thought she was being followed, and that she'd been taking a longer walk home to test how long this van would hang around. After 20 minutes, she walked in the door and locked it behind her. She said she stopped at the end of the driveway to stare this van down as it drove past our house. She flipped it off. She's pretty fearless when it comes to confrontation, but she later explained she was scared because she didn't want them to come to our home and put me in danger. Anyway, when she flipped him off, the van sped away and careened around a corner, disappearing from sight. It was pretty creepy for the next few days, and I asked her to drive to work for the rest of the week. The next few days passed without incident. Fast forward to the incident in question. It was about 5 a.m. on a school day, and my mom was just waking up for work, per her routine to make some coffee and get in the shower. Our kitchen sink is right in front of a window, and our house is all one story. At 5 a.m. it's still dark outside, so she flips on the light over the sink to fill the coffee pot with water. She noticed that the cat was sitting on the counter staring, fixated on something outside. The window was closed, and the light was casting a glare so she couldn't see outside. She flipped off the light and leaned closer to the window to have a peek in the yard, and her scream from the kitchen woke me up from a dead sleep, real damn quick. There was a man with his face about 4 inches from the window, standing in the flower garden, just below the window. He was wearing a black hoodie and a bandana tied around his face so she couldn't see his facial features. Now this is where things get crazy. Her scream woke me up and I shot out of bed and ran to the kitchen. Then she yelled, "What the fuck?" and then ran to the front door and opened it and literally ran outside. Ridiculous, I know, but she grew up in the Flint, Michigan, known for crime. She didn't take any shit. I was honestly scared shitless at this point, having been woken from a dead sleep to learn there was a damn window peeper spying on my mother. I was stunned when she ran to the door, but I instinctively grabbed a knife off the magnetic knife block hanging next to the sink, and I later saw that she had grabbed one as well. I ran to the front door to see her standing on the steps. There wasn't a porch, just steps. She was standing in her pajamas and slippers, with a knife in her hand. It was such an interesting and weird thing to see at 5 a.m. At this point, she's screaming all sorts of obscenities at this guy, who has come to the front of the house since the back, where the kitchen window was, had a fence on one side. So we had no choice but to run around the front to where my mother was now cursing him to high heaven. He must have tripped or something, because when I appeared behind her in the doorway, he was getting off the ground before running down the street. As he ran, I followed him with my eyes, trying to make out the shape of him in the darkness. Parked just outside the glow of the only streetlight around was the white van. It was dark, so I couldn't quite tell if it was the one with the tinted windows, but I hadn't seen another creepy van like that in town, so I'm almost positive it was the same one. I don't think I've ever seen my mom so furious as she was that day. She called the cops and explained everything, and I got in the shower and the shock of it all finally hit me. I cried a little bit, but my mom knocked on the door, so the cops needed to get a witness statement from me, so I hurried up and got dressed. After they left, I went to school and told all my friends, and even my teachers about what happened. They were all pretty shocked and swore they'd keep an eye for the creepy white van with tinted windows. We never found out who it was. We never saw the van again. Since then, I make sure to put all the shades down when I go to bed, so no one can see out or in.
My mom owns her own business and works extremely hard. This means she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out around her. One night, back in 2003, she had her typical routine going, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked third shift at a factory, so she assumed it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply, just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly creeped out, she hung up and called my dad. He told her he hasn't called, and she left it at that. Keep in mind, this was almost 15 years ago, and we lived in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors, and were never scared of dangerous people. But the phone calls kept coming. Every night, multiple times at night, and the person on the other end started talking. He started by saying, "Hello, Diane. You're so beautiful. I'd love to meet you," and things quickly escalated into him going into graphic detail of how he wanted to rape and strangle her. Of course, she stopped answering the phone, and she informed the police, but nothing was ever done, and the phone would continue to ring. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work, and my mom truly believed the calls were just empty threats, so things continued on. Until one night, he got brave. My mom was sitting on the floor, in front of our huge mirrored cabinet, with all her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it as usual. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her, when a glimmer of light in the mirror caught her eye. She looked up to see a pair of eyeglasses peering at her in the reflection. She spun around to face the front door, which her back had been turned to, and a man was standing there staring at her. She said they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever, until she saw the doorknob turn. She started screaming, and the man quickly ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents had started locking all the doors, which was a totally foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time and was aware of the phone calls, came running down the stairs with a baseball bat, but the man was long gone. When the police came, they scoured our property and came across close to 200 cigarette butts right underneath our living room windows, hidden behind bushes. He had been watching her for weeks. The police also happened to find a bike tire trail coming from the windows and going down the sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts and did DNA testing on them and were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived down the street from us. Robert Ham was arrested while riding his bike. He went to prison for menacing and attempt to commit a crime. He had many priors, so we assumed he would be locked up for quite some time. The reason I'm telling this story is because he was released from prison earlier this year.
This might not be the creepiest story in the world, but it terrifies me to think about it. Before I start, let me explain. This happened to me when I was in the first grade. I later moved away from that house when I got older, but when the event occurred, it was behind where my mom's best friend's house was. Luke was a teenager that is now a lazy grown-up, still living with his parents, but at that time he was very active, and his brother Austin was a lazy one. But Austin now has a job at Microsoft and married. Anyway, I'll start the story now. I was in first grade. This is a true story that legitimately happened to me. After I took a shower, I stepped out and dried myself. I went into my room and got dressed. I went out and my mom made me some cereal. My mom goes to her room, and out the window she notices a car just sitting there, the man inside looking down. He looked exactly like my mom's friend Luke, so she just brushed it off. She didn't mention it to me for some reason. 45 minutes later, my mom goes out to leave for work, while me and my sister have 20 minutes to wait for our school bus. My mom still notices a car out there, with the same guy in it with the same expression, and still head looking down. Confused, she went to call Luke. Luke said he wasn't there, and he was actually still sleeping and she'd woke him up. I don't exactly know what happened next, but it was bad enough for my mom to call the police. The cops came and arrested the guy. The reason I know so much about this is because my mom just mentioned it to me yesterday. She didn't say what he was planning to do until now. Apparently the man in the car had a fucking gun on him and planned to kill his ex-girlfriend that lives in my neighborhood. Why he chose our house to camp out on, I don't know.
One evening, when I was 16, I had taken my dog Tex to a park near my house. Tex is technically my dad's dog. My dad worked as a cop in our city, and Tex, a German Shepherd, worked with him as a police dog. We had been there for about 2 hours, and it had started to get dark. So, I got Tex on his leash, and we headed for home. Our house was a few blocks away, and by the time we left the park, it had gotten dark. It was a Sunday night, so it was pretty quiet, until I started to hear a noise behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and across the street, heading in the opposite direction, was a man. He was dressed in an old Hawaiian shirt, with old cargo pants and sneakers. He looked like he might have been about 50 or 60, and was totally bald. The strangest part of the whole scene was that he was dragging a rake behind him. This was the noise I heard. It was an old metal rake, and it was scraping on the pavement behind him. The other weird thing was how Tex reacted. He's always serious when he's on patrol with my dad, but he's normally a marshmallow when he's at home. When he noticed this guy, though, his hackles went right up, his ears went down, and he started to growl. The guy stopped under a streetlight and turned to look at us. He just stared at us for a few minutes, so I tugged on Tex's leash, and we kept walking. After a few minutes, I turned and looked over my shoulder again. The guy was still staring at us, before he suddenly dropped his rake and started running right at us. Tex started barking as loud as he could, trying to get at the guy, while I tried to pull him in the other direction. The guy had stopped when he saw Tex and just stood in the middle of the road. I was dragging Tex away, while the guy continued to just stare. After a few minutes, he went back to get his rake, but this time he started to follow us. He was walking normally, not hurrying or anything, but still following me, dragging his rake behind him. We finally made it to my house, and I told my dad what was happening. When I gave him the description of the guy, he calmly told me to wait in the room and went to make a phone call. My room looks out over the street, and I looked out of my window to see the guy standing in the middle of our driveway. I could hear Tex barking downstairs in the hall, and in the distance I could hear sirens. As I looked down, I noticed that the guy had what looked like paint on his shirt front. I guess I had not noticed it while I was trying to get away. Suddenly, he looked up and noticed me at the window. He stood there, looking at me, and it occurred to me that he wasn't showing any emotion at all. The entire time he'd been walking, running at me and following me, he had always had an emotionless, almost bored face. He stood there, just staring at me. The police sirens got closer, and 3 cars finally pulled up to our house. 3 of the police grabbed the guy, and he went with them calmly into one of these cars. I came downstairs and explained to the police and my parents what had happened. It turns out that the guy was not from our neighborhood, but lived in the city. He had been diagnosed with severe mental issues and must have forgotten to take any of his medications. The police think he'd gotten on a bus with no real destination in mind, and when he got off, just grabbed a rake from someone's yard while he was walking. The paint I had seen was actually blood from someone he met about an hour before me, and he'd just beaten the person up with the rake before continuing on. My dad told me I was lucky I had Tex with me, as he'd clearly deterred the guy from getting too close. I don't go out much after dark now, and when I do, I always make sure I'm either with other people or have Tex nearby. I grew up with a very outdoorsy family. We always went camping and hiking in the summer. My mother told this story to my sister and I about a time she went camping with my dad before we were born. I was in my tent, and it was the middle of the night, perhaps 1 a.m., and I had woken up to go pee, just like normal. I was about to unzip the tent when I heard a small scratching sound. I paused. It was a slow, deliberate, crunchy digging kind of sound. It was too rhythmic for an animal, so after making sure it wasn't your father who was sharing the tent, I unzipped a corner of the door and peeked out. The moon was just bright enough for me to see a young woman squatting next to our little 2-man tent, digging at the ground with her bare hands. Even your father was scared, so he went and shined a flashlight on her and told her to go back to wherever she had made camp. The woman got up silently, leaving a 4-inch deep hole next to the tent, and started walking away. I went outside, went pee, and got back into my sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I was awoken again by a clattering sound of a person or animal walking around where we had put our stuff. I looked outside again, and the woman was crouched low, walking around our stuff and looking at things the way a monkey might. Your father stepped out of the tent, shined the flashlight on her again, and she faced him. He asked her to kindly leave our stuff alone, but she just stood there, dirty and neglected looking, but clearly not malnourished, staring at his light. He gave up and went back into our tent. Soon we heard her digging again at her little hole, which was literally 6 inches and 2 pieces of thin nylon away from my head. I shouted for her to go away, and she ran away in an animalistic kind of way and never returned. I fell back asleep, and in the morning our stuff was scattered, but nothing was stolen.